In our last lesson, we were introduced to the Russian Revolution of October 1917. And it is with this Russian Revolution of 1917 that the Bolsheviks now took over power in Russia. But this is not to say that political turbulence and turmoil had completely ended in Russia. Russia was still embroiled in a lot of conflicts and turmoils. Now, when we talked about the Bolsheviks and how they took over power, we learnt that immediately after the revolution, the Bolsheviks had declared all lands as social property. And in fact, the peasants were also allowed to seize the lands which were owned by the wealthy landowners. Now, when this process of land distribution began in Russia after the revolution, many issues took place. Why is it so? This is because the beginning of the process of land redistribution in Russia required the soldiers, who were mostly peasants, to go back home. So the soldiers who served in the Red Army, which was the army of the Bolshevik party, now had to go back home to take care of the newly acquired lands. And because all these soldiers from the Red Army were now going back home, the Red Army had begun disintegrating. So this was a very big problem that started with the land redistribution in Russia after the revolution. In one of our lessons, we mentioned the point that not all people have similar responses to the same event. And likewise happened in Russia during and after the Russian Revolution of October 1917. While there were many people who supported the Bolshevik takeover of power in Russia, there were a whole lot of people who supported autocratic rule. They believed that it was better to be ruled by the autocratic czars than the Bolsheviks. So these non-Bolshevik socialists, along with the liberals and the supporters of autocracy, now organized troops, and these troops in South Russia were meant to defeat the Bolsheviks or the Reds. Red, being the color of communism, became the symbol for the Bolsheviks. Now all these groups, which were basically non-Bolshevik factions, now started to organize themselves, mobilize themselves so as to be able to defeat the Bolsheviks or the Reds. And following this now took place a split in the population. We learnt that many people were not in favor or support of the Bolshevik takeover of power in Russia. And between 1918 and 1919, the regions that were covered by the erstwhile Russian Empire once again went under the control of the socialist revolutionaries as well as the pro-czarists. Now here is an interesting point about these socialist revolutionaries as well as these pro-czarists. Now these groups were non-Bolshevik factions, keep this in mind, and there were particular colors to designate these groups. We just learned that the Bolsheviks were called the Reds because red was the color of communism, and these socialist revolutionaries were called the Greens, and the pro-czarists, or those people who supported the autocratic rule of the czars in Russia, were called the Whites. So now the population in Russia was split among the Reds, Whites and Greens. Now the Whites and Greens, or the pro-czarists and the revolutionaries, had joined hands to defeat the Reds. So this is how the population was split in terms of their responses to the Tsar's rule as well as the Bolshevik rule in Russia. Now how do you think did these non-Bolshevik groups manage to take control of those regions which were controlled by the Imperial Russia. Because it were the Bolsheviks who were in power in Russia at this point of time. And we also know that the Bolshevik party was the only party to rule in Russia. So how did these non-Bolshevik groups get the power and authority to get control over new lands? This is because these non-Bolshevik groups were backed by French, American, British and Japanese troops. Now, why do you think were the French, American, British and Japanese troops supporting the non-Bolshevik groups in their protest as well as their rebellion against the Bolsheviks? For this, you will have to understand the world politics at this point of time. Now, the Bolsheviks were pro-communists. They believed in the abolition of private property. They believed in the abolition of accumulation or concentration of wealth in the hands of only few people in the society. Instead, the Bolsheviks wanted to establish a communist state in which there would be no classes, there would be no social hierarchy, and property or the modes of production would be owned by the state or the people. And the political ideologies of these countries like France, America, Britain, Japan were contradicted by this communist ideology. So, communism was in direct opposition to the ideology of capitalism that served the interests of the leaders of France, America, Britain, Japan. And so they started fearing that socialism and communism would now eventually spread from Russia throughout Europe as well as in different parts of the globe. And so they wanted to put the Bolsheviks or the communists in place. And for this reason, these troops now started helping the non-Bolshevik groups in their protest as well as rebellions against the Bolsheviks or the Reds in Russia. So from this, what we can understand is that Russia was very far from achieving political unification, from achieving political peace in the state itself, because the population was divided into several groups. Some groups wanted the Bolsheviks to rule, while other groups wanted the autocratic regime to be reinstated in Russia. And for this reason, 1917 onwards, Russia was embroiled in a civil war. Now, what do we understand by a civil war? Our concept of war entails foreign invasions. We believe that when a country, a region, a territory or a kingdom is invaded by any foreign power, war takes place. Well, that is the traditional concept of a war, against which we need to understand what a civil war means. A civil war takes place when dissident groups within the same country war and get embroiled in conflicts amongst themselves. So in Russia, it were the Bolsheviks and the non-Bolsheviks, that included the socialists, liberals and supporters of autocracy, who were now embroiled in a civil war. No war in the history of the world has ever been good, whatever be the reason for which it is fought. And likewise, when the Russian Civil War broke out 1917 onwards, the Russian society, the Russian population were severely affected, and looting, banditry, famines became too frequent during the Russian Civil War. We know that the Bolsheviks had allowed the peasants to seize the lands of the wealthy landowners. So at this point of time, when the Russian Civil War had broken out, when the non-Bolshevik groups were once again surfacing and they were slowly coming to power, these non-Bolsheviks now started a very bad treatment against those peasants. During the Civil War, the non-Bolsheviks' brutal treatment of the peasants who had seized their lands brought them disapproval and disfavor. So those peasants who had seized the lands of the wealthy landowners, the nobles earlier on, were now being brutally tortured or even killed by the non-Bolsheviks. And so, because of this harsh and miserable treatment that they were meting out to the peasants, the non-Bolsheviks now earned themselves disapproval and disfavor from the Russian masses. Now, during the Civil War, Russia was embroiled in a state of constant power tussle. And when the non-Bolshevik groups were once again fading out of power and prominence because their treatment towards the peasants brought them disapproval and disfavor, the Bolsheviks once again regained power in Russia. And this happened by January 1920. The Bolsheviks also began cooperating with the non-Russian population, which included the jihadists who were Muslim reformers in the erstwhile Russian Empire. And by cooperating with the non-Russian populations, with the jihadists, the Bolsheviks once again regained power and control over Russia. So from this we can understand how the balance of power kept on tilting at different ends alternatively. Now here let me introduce you to the irony of this story. When the Russian Revolution had not broken out, that is to say in the years preceding the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks mentioned that they were for all the people. They wanted to achieve equality in the society. They wanted to end the oppression of the lower class people by the upper class people, by the wealthy and the propertied men. And these Bolsheviks also sought to end private enterprises, private ownership of property. And these were the ideas that they kept on putting forward during the years of the Russian Revolution or even during the Russian Civil War. But this was a time when the European powers had established their colonies in several parts of the world. And these colonies were established through the 17th and 18th centuries. And Russia was no exception. Russia also had its colonies in several parts of the world. And many of these Russian colonists had joined the Bolshevik group. And this caused great embarrassment to the Bolsheviks because the Bolsheviks were against the private ownership of wealth, against the oppression of the lower classes. But all these colonists did was to oppress the native population in the colonies. And so, the Russian masses were thinking what the real aim of the Bolsheviks were. And at this point of time, let us now travel to a place called Khiva in Central Asia. And this is located in the present day country called Uzbekistan. And in Khiva, in the present day country of Uzbekistan, many Russian colonists began massacring the local nationalists. Now, why did the Russian colonists do so? They did so in order to protect and foster the ideas of socialism among the masses. So, just for defending the principles of socialism, these Russian colonists were massacring the indigenous population. And this left the Russian masses in a state of confusion, because they were not being able to understand what the Bolsheviks, what these socialists and communists wanted to do in reality. Now, this was a time when many changes were happening throughout the world. Now, in the eastern part of the world, communism and socialism had spread very rapidly. In fact, the world was almost broken into two halves. The Eastern Bloc, which was under the influence of communism, and the Western Bloc, which was under the influence of capitalism. And on December 30, 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, that came to be known as the USSR or the Soviet Union, was formed by the Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian and Transcaucasian Soviet republics that were ruled by Bolshevik parties. So from this we can understand how the USSR or these independent republics were under the influence of communism, and these republics formed the USSR on December 30, 1922. Now before proceeding with this lesson, let me ask you a question. When was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, that came to be known as the USSR, formed? Was it formed on December 30, 1923, November 30, 1922, or on December 30, 1922, or on December 31, 1922? The correct answer is December 30, 1922. It was on this date that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics or the USSR or the Soviet Union was formed. Now the USSR kept on increasing its power in the eastern parts of the world, and by 1956 there were 15 constituent SSRs or Soviet Socialist Republics under the USSR. And the USSR was in fact the largest country in the world till its disintegration in 1991. Now, as a reconciliatory or remedial approach, the non-Russian nationals were given autonomy in the newly formed USSR. We just learned how the masses were not able to understand what the real aim of the Bolshevik party was. Because while in the USSR, the Bolshevik party was talking about abolishing private property, the Russian colonists in different parts of the world were massacring the local nationalists. And so the masses were left in a state of confusion. And to this end, the USSR granted autonomy to the non-Russian nationalists. But these reconciliatory or remedial approaches were of no great avail. In this lesson, we learnt about the Russian Civil War that Russia was embroiled in between 1918 and 1919, immediately after the Russian Revolution of October 1917. We learned that many sections of the Russian population were not in favor of the Bolshevik takeover of power, which is why various groups were trying to assert their own power and take control of their lands. And so the Bolsheviks came into conflict with the non-Bolsheviks, who were then backed by the French, American, British and Japanese troops. And in a series of constant power tussles, power conflicts, once the Bolsheviks came to power, while on the other hand, at other times, the non-Bolsheviks kept surfacing. So this is what kept on happening in Russia during this time of immense political turmoil and turbulence. In our subsequent lesson, we will be focusing on the decades that followed the Russian Civil War. Now in that lesson, we will be introduced to a new epoch in the history of Russia. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.